Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is the role of hydropower in state clean energy policy. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and we have a number of excellent guest speakers with us on the line today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can connect via telephone or you can call in via computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there. You can also click on that arrow to expand the webinar console. And a very important thing to see on your webinar console is the questions box. We encourage you to submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar as you think of them by typing them into the questions box and hitting send. We will save some time at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So again, do type your questions and comments in as you think of them. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides within about 48 hours. And we will also post those webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague, Val Stori. Val is a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she will be starting us off today. Val?
Great, thanks everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to all our panelists for joining us. For those of you who don't know, the Clean Energy States Alliance is a national nonprofit based out of Montpelier, Vermont, and we work with our members who are state energy offices and related agencies across the U.S., and we work with them to advance renewable energy policy, and we also provide technology support and other technical support to our membership. Next slide. So today we have 3 speakers, including me, and first up to set the stage for today's webinar, I want to introduce Rebecca ONeill, who's a program manager at PNNL, or the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. There, she oversees clean energy technical research with a focus on water, hydropower, and energy storage. She leads the renewables team within the Electrical Infrastructure Division. Rebecca, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Val. Val has and CESA has offered me an opportunity to provide a few introductory remarks about why this report exists. So I just want to introduce myself again. I'm Rebecca ONeill. I work for Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is a part of the U.S. Department of Energy's National Laboratory System. PNNL is based in the Pacific Northwest, as you might imagine, in Richland, Washington, but we have offices across the Northwest, including a marine sciences laboratory on the Olympic Peninsula. And our laboratory has deep expertise in hydropower facilities because we work very closely with the region. And I'm sure you're aware there's a lot of federal hydropower as well as non-federal hydropower based in the Northwest. We asked CESA to create this report because, and as you can see from reading the report, that when you look across at state clean energy policies, it is remarkable how varied the treatment of hydropower resources is state by state. And this is actually a very important insight because clean energy policies are the way that states shape their energy futures. What do states and citizens want their future energy system to look like? And we know that the policies are not static, they're going to change and evolve. And so having a sensibility, a current sensibility about how states treat hydropower resources in a comprehensive fashion could be really vital. CESA did a preliminary version of a similar report back in 2013, and it was really the only report of its kind back then. And so when the U.S. Department of Energy published its hydropower vision in 2016, the Water Power Technologies Office relied on that report. The authors relied on that report for its analytical insight. And in one of the roadmap actions, it spoke to the continued need for sharing these policies and the status. So it's been on our radar and the DOE level, at the federal level, that we need to keep tracking this. And so DOE was supportive when our laboratory sponsored this report because it's more quality, transparent, publicly available information about the hydropower sector. And there is so much interest at the federal level at this kind of information about what are states trying to do with hydropower resources and clean energy futures. So when we wanted an update, we came back to CESA because they're a natural fit for all the reasons Val just outlined. But it was important to look at it in aggregate, and we really wanted the state's perspective to understand why they chose the requirements that they did. And so some of that insight is really in this report, which is very helpful for us when we're looking across all states, and also to think about the net effects of these policies on hydropower resources, because of course our grid is not state by state, our grid is regional, or you know, at the interconnection level, operating at a western eastern level. So really important to think about what do these policies that are driven at a state level do to facilities for financial incentives and for their operations. So we are really glad to see that this report is not simply a list of eligibility, but it actually provides the state perspective. It looks at other clean energy policies beyond renewable portfolio standards, this next generation of policies for energy storage mandates, incentives. And then I believe Jason's going to speak to what does that really mean at the plant level? How are these plants actually contributing to the markets? How are they helping utilities comply with the requirements or states measure the requirements? What is the role of hydropower in actually meeting the requirements, which is important for us to understand in terms of hydropower's competitiveness and its compensation. So thank you to Val and her team for offering this report. For those of you that are interested in kind of continually tracking at a higher level hydropower resources, our sister laboratory, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, will be publishing in the next few months its Hydropower Market Report. This is published every 2 to 3 years, and it's statistically driven, and it's a very deep look at hydropower sector-wide. So if there's any interest in that, please feel free to contact me, and I'll make sure that these copies are distributed to the states. But I guess I'll conclude my remarks and again say thank you to CESA for being willing to publish this report, and I think it's outstanding, and I look forward to the results.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Val again, and let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Val Stori. I'm a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and I largely work on offshore wind and building electrification, and I dabble in renewable portfolio standards as well, which is how I come into play here on this report. So I'm going to be speaking next and give a high-level introduction to the report, and then I'm going to pause and hand it over to our next panelist, Jason Gifford from Sustainable Energy Advantage, who's going to walk you through some terrific data that they gathered specifically on New England and New England markets. And then you'll bounce back to me for an introduction to pumped hydro energy storage's role in both RPSs and in state energy storage policies. So with that, let me actually introduce you to the report itself. The report is called The Role of Hydropower in State Clean Energy Policy, How States Include Hydropower in Renewable Portfolio Standards and in State Energy Storage Mandates and Targets. So I'm going to cover specifically the results from parts 1 and part 3 of the paper, which focus on hydropower eligibility criteria for state renewable portfolio standards and on pumped hydropower's role in both RPS and in state energy storage mandates and targets. So going back to what Rebecca was mentioning, when she asked us if we would write a hydropower state policy report to take a look at what has changed since our 2013 report and the opportunities and barriers to hydropower's participation in state RPSs. We dusted off that 2013 report, which looked at environmental criteria for hydropower participation in state RPSs. Both the 2013 report and this new report focused on renewable portfolio standards because while there are a suite of policies spurring renewable energy growth and driving investments, the RPS has likely been the single most influential state policy mechanism for increasing the development of state clean energy capacity. It's really our baseline policy. So we looked to this policy to see how hydropower was participating. States frequently modify their renewable portfolio standards, and I'll give a few examples later on in my slides. And the dominant trend that states have taken since 2013 has been to increase the obligation and to extend the date by which compliance is required. So there are 30 states plus the District of Columbia that have an RPS. And since 2015, 14 states plus DC have increased their near-term targets, and they've also set higher and longer-term targets. And as states increase these targets and adopt in parallel new 100% clean energy standards, we asked ourselves how and if the treatment of hydropower in state RPSs have evolved. In addition, we wanted to answer the question, how are environmental criteria and other eligibility criteria affecting hydropower's participation? And this is where we worked with Sustainable Energy Advantage to take a deeper look at hydropower's role in New England's RPS markets and to see how each state's eligibility criteria affect hydropower's participation. You'll hear from Jason Gifford, our next panelist from SEA, who has a lot of data and unique insights into NEPOOL GIS, and who are experts in tracking and analyzing regional REC markets. Lastly, before we move on to the report's key findings, in part 3 of the report, we wanted to take a look at whether hydropower was an eligible technology in the recent suite of state energy storage policies. And in this section of the report, we explore pumped hydro's eligibility in both state RPS programs and in these energy storage policies. And we discuss why programs and policies often overlook the technology, but why you may want to consider the questions a state may want to ask itself when they're considering whether to put energy storage policy within an RPS or create a different policy, such as a state mandate or target. So moving on to the report's key findings, which are up on your screen, the report begins with some key findings in the executive summary and then includes key takeaways for each section of the report, offering suggestions for state policy action that could support hydropower markets. The broad takeaways from the report: hydropower is a clean and abundant resource that can help states meet their increasing renewable and clean energy targets. And this is especially true for states that are increasing their RPS targets and for those that are adopting or have adopted new 100% clean energy standards. States are largely using eligibility criteria such as capacity limits or technology type as de facto environmental safeguards. We found that to be true in the 2013 report. That said, we found that while 5 states are using the low impact hydropower standards, I think that's on my end, sorry about that. All right, pick back off. Okay, so we found that while 5 states are using the LEHI's, the Low Impact Hydropower Institute's standards in one or more tiers, the environmental criteria that LEHI has set are being replicated and used by a host of other states. And while all 30 state RPS programs include hydropower as a qualifying technology, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, there are significant differences in how each state treats hydropower. And we'll see some examples of that in a little bit. In terms of how RPS programs treat pumped hydro energy storage, we found that 5 out of 30 state RPS programs consider pumped hydro as an eligible technology. And it's likely that it's so few state RPS programs that consider pumped hydro an eligible technology, because one of the original motivations of RPS programs was to develop markets for emerging innovative new renewables such as wind and solar to make them more competitive. And pumped hydro was considered a well-established technology that could compete without the help of financial support. Lastly, in terms of pumped hydro's participation in state energy storage policies themselves, its participation is indirectly limited by contracting structures, capacity limits, and commissioning dates. We found that pumped hydro is eligible in 4 out of 6 state energy storage policies. Next slide. Thanks, Sam. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, RPS policies and program structures can vary significantly from state to state. And we see the greatest variation in how technologies are treated. We see that in biomass and in hydropower. And in terms of hydropower, different state treatment of RPS programs is due to differences in perceptions about hydropower's environmental impacts and its benefits, about whether a state has a long established relationship with the technology, and whether a state or the region has historically relied on hydropower for achieving its RPS goals. And as you'll learn from Jason's presentation, the RPS can provide significant financial support for hydropower facilities depending on the tier into which it qualifies. Next slide. So in general, RPS programs qualify or limit hydro's participation through eligibility criteria. You'll see these up on your screen. These are size or capacity limits, in-service date, technology type, and by technology type, I mean new impoundments, a run-of-river facility, or capacity additions. Other eligibility criteria include geographic eligibility, specific environmental criteria, and as I mentioned before, the Low Impact Hydropower Institute's certification is an eligibility criteria in some states. I don't have time to get into each of these criteria in depth, but I will highlight how RPS programs use tiers to differentiate hydropower. It's in general, the smaller capacity projects qualify for Tier 1, Class 1, which is also referred to as the growth tier. And in general, these are the higher value REC tiers. The cap for the growth tier is, for the majority of states, is set at around 30 megawatts, though there is a great degree of variation. For example, New York caps Tier 1 eligibility at 5 megawatts, and New Hampshire's Tier 1 only allows incremental capacity increases over a historical baseline. On the other hand, Iowa qualifies small facilities as a facility up to 80 megawatts in capacity. And then there are the 11 states that have at least one tier without any kind of capacity limit. In terms of the in-service dates, these are restrictions on the date of a facility. So restrictions on the in-service date of a facility represent the most significant barrier for hydropower inclusion in state RPS programs. Again, like the size or capacity limit, Tier 1 is again more restrictive and is generally reserved for newer facilities that began commercial operation after a certain date, or that added incremental capacity after a certain date. And that could be either through efficiency improvements or capacity improvements. In general, most hydropower facilities have a cutoff point set in the mid-90s, but again, there is quite a bit of variability. And to highlight the variability in how states set in-service date criteria in Tier 1. So for example, New Jersey restricts Tier 1 eligibility to facilities in service after July 2012, whereas Massachusetts allows facilities that began commercial operation after December 1997. So just highlighting some of the state-by-state differences. In terms of technology type, the states are evenly split on between those that prohibit new impoundments and those that allow new dams and diversions. Those that allow new impoundments place mitigation measures such as requiring adequate fish passage criteria or including other de facto environmental criteria such as capacity limitations on top of their, as part of their mitigation for impoundments. Of those that, actually across the board, most RPS programs favor the run-of-river systems, which are perceived to have fewer environmental impacts. In addition, most of the states allow incremental improvements at older facilities, And again, those can be made through efficiency upgrades or capacity additions. And it's often only the portion of the output that is attributable to improvements that are made after a certain date can qualify. So there are layers. You can have an in-service date on top of a capacity addition criteria. In terms of geographic eligibility, like all other renewables, hydropower from out of state qualifies in RPS programs across the board. And eligibility can be limited to a region. So eligibility is limited to facilities within the territory of a regional transmission operator. There are exceptions to that. In the report, we cover Vermont and Wisconsin, which are unique in that they allow Canadian hydropower to qualify for their RPS programs. Vermont's Renewable Energy Standard allows existing Canadian hydropower to qualify for Tier 1, but this Canadian hydropower participates without unit-specific certificates. And so the size of the facilities participating in this tier is unknown. Let's see. As I mentioned earlier, many states use the eligibility criteria I quickly reviewed as de facto environmental criteria, meant to limit hydropower's impacts on the environment. But as we discovered in the 2013 report, these criteria, capacity, age, technology type, they don't necessarily correlate with environmental impact. It's more the operation and the location of the facility that can have a greater environmental impact. And so the 15 states limit eligibility with additional environmental criteria. For example, Delaware limits eligibility to facilities that have additional measures that ensure adequate water flow, that include fish passage structures, that have adopted, and they have also adopted environmental criteria identical to Lehigh's. In addition, Delaware requires that facilities protect cultural and historical resources, and that it protects threatened and endangered species and their habitat. The last criteria I briefly want to touch upon is Lehigh certification. There are 5 states that require Lehigh certification in one or more tier for eligibility. Lehigh has developed a certification standard for hydropower facilities based on 8 qualifying criteria that reduce environmental, cultural, and recreational impacts. And while only 5 states require the Lehigh certification for RPS eligibility, Lehigh's reach has extended beyond these 5 states. We found that 4 states have adopted standards modeled on Lehigh's for RPS eligibility. Next slide. All right, here I just wanted to briefly give you a look at some of the states we covered in the report that I felt were somewhat unique. So we took a look at Washington, Washington State, which has always included hydropower eligibility. But it wasn't until the passage of the Clean Energy Transformation Act in May 2019 that hydropower's eligibility in the RPS was expanded. Prior to that, hydropower's eligibility was limited to incremental generation from capacity additions. And now hydropower from existing dams can be used for the new RPS 100% clean electricity by 2045 standard. For Massachusetts Class 1, in 2018, Massachusetts increased its RPS target to 35% by 2030, and its Class 1 requirement increases by 2% annually between 2020 and 2029 before it reverts to an annual 1% indefinite increase. So I just chose this example to show that RPS's programs are always evolving. Yeah, let's see, what can I tell you? In terms of Connecticut, I'm jumping to Connecticut here. A hydropower facility is eligible for Class 1 only if it's run-of-river and smaller than 30 megawatts. Or it can be a run-of-river facility that received a new license from FERC after 2018. And in terms of New Hampshire has a hydropower only tier. This is its Class 4. And Class 4 permits either existing small hydro up to 5 megawatts, provided that the facility began commercial operation before 2006 and had installed diadromous fish passages approved by FERC, or facilities 1 megawatt or less that comply with FERC fish passage requirements and are interconnected to New Hampshire's grid are eligible. So that's just a small taste of the differences in eligibility criteria and how RPSs treat hydropower across the nation. What we're going to do next is we are going to switch over to Jason Gifford. Now let me introduce Jason, and he's going to dive into hydropower's participation in New England's RPS market. So Jason Gifford is a senior director at Sustainable Energy Advantage, and he has over 20 years of experience in renewable energy markets. At SCA, Jason leads policy, market, and financial analyses for a wide range of public and private sector entities. Jason, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Val. Thank you to CESA for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity and everyone's time that has joined the call today. For those who may not be familiar with us, SCA is an independent analysis and consulting firm. We specialize in analysis of renewable energy policy options and their implications for a wide range of market participants. So to this end, my remarks today represent our objective analysis of the New England RPS market rather than advocacy for how it should work or how hydro should be treated. So with that, let's start with the who. There are 434 hydro units registered in the NEPOOL GIS, that's Generation Information System, which is the production tracking system for the creation of RECs in New England. 404 of those facilities are located within New England, and the remainder are importing facilities, which you can do from neighboring control areas as long as the energy is imported with the RECs. So all told, these facilities account for about 8.5 million RECs in 2018, and again, where 1 REC equals 1 megawatt hour, and RECs are the currency for demonstrating RPS compliance. Each of these units is certified in at least one RPS market, but one of the key takeaways from my remarks today is that this doesn't necessarily guarantee REC revenue. And many projects are only eligible in markets that are significantly oversupplied. We'll come back to this issue again when we talk about REC prices. But for the meantime, the eligibility rules really matter. And unfortunately, they're also really complicated. The rules vary by state, and Val framed this up really nicely, which I appreciate. Thank you. In short, because each locale has its own policy objectives. Generally speaking, RPS mandates fall into two categories. You've heard a little bit about this already. One are those designated to encourage new facilities. And these categories generally have targets that increase over time. And then the second group are those designated, designed to maintain the existing fleet. So these RPS categories generally have targets that are stable over time, or they're either literally static or regulators have the ability to tinker with them a little bit with the objective of keeping supply and demand relatively balanced. In either case, the opportunity to participate depends on facility technology, on vintage, we referred to before as in-service date or commercial operation date, and other criteria. I'm not going to go through each of the state eligibility criteria in general right now. I'm happy to come back and answer questions about them. But for the meantime, you can see that depending on the category, participating facilities might range from less than 5 megawatts to 100 megawatts or more. And because the commercial operation date requirement, most hydro is eligible for the so-called existing RPS categories. So really, with the intention of trying to cut right to the key takeaways in the areas I think you might be most interested in, let's overlay eligibility criteria onto specific individual markets and look at potential REC revenue to qualifying facilities. So this slide is intended to give you a snapshot of current market REC prices. And I did go ahead and update the numbers here to be as current as possible. So these are estimates from this summer, as opposed to some time ago when much of this report was pulled together. I thought that would be helpful for the purpose of our discussion today. A few notes are provided for each to help explain the market conditions that are present that lead to these prices. Facilities that are able to participate in Class 1 markets, again, generally for new supply, as previously defined, have much greater revenue potential than those eligible only for Class 2 or other existing markets. We could probably spend the entirety of the webinar picking apart how and why REC revenue might vary between less than $1 to $40 a megawatt hour, but Val set the stage well, and it really relates to the eligibility criteria for hydro, for other resources, and whether the demand in that category is constantly increasing, which puts tension on the market, or whether it's relatively stable and designed to match the supply eligible in the market, which would tend to suppress price with the objective of providing only as much revenue as is barely required to keep the existing fleet maintained and operating. And I'm more than happy to come back to the slide if there are any number of specific questions. This slide demonstrates historical hydro contributions to RPS compliance. So these data come from published compliance reports or sometimes individual filings in each of the states. The chart on the left provides a snapshot from 2016. And really what this tells you is that in markets where multiple technologies are eligible, hydro plays a smaller role, as you might expect, because its own eligibility is limited and it competes with other technologies. And then in categories that are designated either towards hydro or towards existing fleet, which hydro comprises a significant portion of, the hydro participation is much higher, all the way to the extreme of the Rhode Island so-called existing tier, which is 99.8% or so comprised of hydro. Referring back to the prior slide, though, interestingly, it's also one of the markets that has very broad eligibility and ample supply. So if you visualize the game of musical chairs, even at 99%, there's still many, many hydro RECs in the market that aren't even able to participate and capture the 70 cents or so of REC revenue potential per megawatt hour. The chart on the right shows the composition of supply over time. And that generally, it hasn't changed a whole lot for most tiers in the 2009 to 2016 timeframe shown. I've provided a few labels on the lines and circles in the legend below just to help you pick out the individual markets in case some of the colors started to run together. But you'll see participation has been generally stable over time. I think that the notable exception is in Massachusetts Class 2, which you see has a kink right after 2012, in which hydro participation increased from around 10% to around 70% or so. One of the things that happened exactly at this time is that the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources changed the hydro eligibility criteria from up to 5 megawatts to instead up to 7.5 megawatts. So this allowed some additional facility participation more or less overnight, and you see that reflected in the change between 2012 and 2013 compliance. So because policy objectives and the policymakers themselves change over time, so do RPS market rules and dynamics. This slide picks out a few changes that are particularly relevant to hydro. In 2012, we have not only the Massachusetts Class 2 change that I just mentioned, but at the same time, the Massachusetts Class 1 standard was increased to allow hydro up to 30 megawatts rather than 25. Going in the other direction, in 2017, Connecticut actually removed hydro eligibility from its Class 2, making it a dedicated waste to energy tier. In the same year in Massachusetts, a clean energy standard was created, and this is an example of the dawning of a new age, if you will, of clean energy policy alongside renewable energy policies, where the objective is less construction of new renewable energy facilities, which has always been the RPS Class 1 goal, and more the minimization of greenhouse gas emissions, or more specifically, the achievement of greenhouse gas goals as they're written from state to state and associated emissions levels. So what Massachusetts did in 2017 was create a clean energy standard that effectively wraps around the Class 1 RPS and creates an incremental requirement. But at the same time, they went ahead and solicited and then approved contracts for 9.45 terawatt hours of Canadian hydro. So this is well above the amount that the clean energy standard would ever require. So in fact, what will happen there is if and when that hydro is deliverable, and I say it that way because it requires completion of a proposed new transmission line, which would enter through Maine, that would provide all of the hydro necessary to meet the clean energy standard, plus a significant amount extra, the premium for which would be collected from all distribution customers. In 2018, Connecticut made a change to the Class 1 eligibility requirement, allowing FERC relicensed run-of-river hydro. In 2019, just last year, Maine made a small change to its Class 1 requirement for what it calls qualified hydroelectric output. This was a fairly specific change that ended up targeting just a couple of facilities, which now can participate in the Class 1 market rather than the existing market. And then lastly, just really within the last few months, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection used its authority to establish a clean energy standard for existing facilities. The CESE refers to something separate than just the plain CES. This is for pre-2011 hydro, must be greater than 30 megawatts and located in Massachusetts, Connecticut, or New Hampshire, or Eastern Canada. And the CESE, which will be for 20% of Massachusetts load, also allows nuclear assets to participate. Again, specifically those in New Hampshire and Connecticut, which means the Seabrook facility and the 2 Millstone units. So wrapping up, a few observations for your consideration and our discussion, if there are questions, is hydro participation in New England RPS markets is as varied as the facilities themselves. No two markets are the same, and the details, as we've started to describe them to you, really matter a lot. Hydro eligibility criteria vary by state and by class within state, and the dynamics between those markets are complex. It is a large and partially overlapping Venn diagram, so that all of the markets are interrelated in some way, but none of them behave exactly the same way. So that makes for a very dynamic market where changes in one impact the other, And so we constantly monitor these dynamics to help estimate what we think expectations should be for REC prices going forward. The policy objectives and then following that, the rules are subject to change over time. We went through a couple of those examples on the prior slide. And so the resulting changes to the supply or the demand side will impact REC price and what opportunities are ultimately available to hydroelectric and other qualifying generators. So if you're participating in this market or considering doing so, the accessibility of REC revenues really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, meaning both case-by-case as to state and class and by facility to determine what markets are open to you, what the competition might look like, what the competing the factors might be that could lead to changes in REC revenue over time, which would be an important thing to look at, particularly if your participation required any kind of capital improvements that you might need to collect over time. So just lastly, a few thoughts to consider along with the former as you think about REC markets and participation. One is market liquidity. Some of these markets are quite thinly traded. So while I've given you some examples of REC prices in individual markets, they're not always reliably accessible at exactly when you need them and exactly at the volume you need them. So important to keep in mind. And then lastly, there is a trend, as evidenced by the CES, which where policymakers are looking at 80, 90, and 100% targets and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and meeting RGGI type standards. So this too is introducing potential opportunities for non-emitting but not traditionally Class 1 RPS eligible resources like large hydro. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to answer questions later on.
Great, Jason, thank you. Yes, a reminder for folks to please type in their questions into the question chat box. So Sam, we're gonna switch back over to I believe it's slide 5. Great, thanks. And I am aware that we are closing in on the hour, and I want to leave some time for some high-level takeaways and also answer one of the questions that Rebecca posed to us in the beginning when we started this paper is, what does the future hold for hydropower? What does it look like? What are some policy actions that states could take to open up markets for hydropower? So I'm going to go through the pumped hydro energy storage section, our report, very quickly, and I will refer you to the report for details. So let me go through some of the key findings. So most state energy storage policies don't address the type of grid scale solutions that's offered by pumped hydro energy storage. And they don't include pumped hydro largely because pumped hydro takes a really long time, about 10 years to permit and construct, whereas state mandates and targets, they're really focused on the short term. And there we're thinking the next 3 to 5 years. We see that in some of the energy storage targets and mandates that came out. I think it's I might be wrong here, but I think it's the New Jersey recent order that has biennial targets. So that, that's really short term, too short term for traditional pumped hydro energy storage. Another reason that pumped hydro is generally not considered in energy storage mandates is that states like California have stated that their purpose of their procurements and their programs is to accelerate the deployment of innovative technologies. And pumped hydro is a well-established technology, although there are new innovations, but as traditional pumped hydro has been around for a long time. There is also the concern that one large pump hydro energy storage project could fulfill an entire procurement's targets. This section also covers pumped hydro participation storage in RPSs. And I think I mentioned earlier that we found that pumped hydro is an eligible technology in 5 out of 30 state RPS programs. And while the technology is a good complement to an increasing amount of variable renewable energy technologies because it can provide reliability and ancillary services to the grid, including it can defer the need for new transmission, again, given that pumped hydro is a well-established technology and that it consumes electricity to pump water up the hill to fill the reservoir, and that electricity is not necessarily from renewables, little consideration was given to including pumped hydro in RPSs. In fact, there are 7 programs that explicitly prohibit pumped hydro participation in RPS. Very briefly, out of the 5 states that allow pumped hydro participation in the RPS, there are eligibility restrictions that include, for example, the only portion of the energy that's eligible for the RPS is the portion of that, is the renewable portion that was used for the pumping action. There are also some size limitations. For example, Nevada allows existing facilities up to 30 megawatts to qualify. So in general, if states are going to consider pumped hydro energy storage either in their RPS or their pumped hydro energy storage specific policy, they should think about their energy storage objectives and decide whether an RPS would be the most effective policy mechanism for achieving those objectives, or if it would work better to incorporate that storage into a separate energy storage mandate. Let's see, my last bullet there I briefly touched upon, but those are some of the barriers to inclusion in state energy storage policies: perceived siting constraints, perceived environmental impacts, long permitting and construction timelines. Next slide. Let's do the next, go to the next slide as well. Thanks, just want to breeze through some of this. So the report covers the following 5 energy storage policies and takes a look at whether or not the mandate or target includes pumped hydro eligibility. Largely, we found that most of the energy storage specific policies are technology neutral, but as I mentioned, pumped hydro is indirectly limited by contracting structures and the like. We go through California, Oregon, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York's legislation. I'll just give you briefly some examples. So when we looked at the Massachusetts legislation, we found that the mandate is technology specific and it excludes pumped hydro. However, the 2018 legislation in Massachusetts, an Act to Advance Clean Energy, included a second and actually a larger storage target of 1,000 megawatts, but that's by 2025. Pumped hydro, this is an example of a technology neutral mandate. So pumped hydro is not expressly prohibited, but the bill's language refers to energy storage systems that provide peak load reductions at customer sites. So that in itself limits, makes pumped hydro ineligible. So that's all I want to say, unfortunately, about pumped hydro in both RPSs and energy storage mandates. Again, I'll refer you to section 3 of the report because I do want to talk about what does this all mean for pumped hydro? What are the opportunities? As we talked about earlier, and Jason also mentioned Massachusetts Clean Energy Standard, we see an opportunity for hydro eligibility in clean energy standards or in other similar zero carbon solicitations. For example, in Connecticut in 2018, they released a zero carbon solicitation, and although large hydropower project was ultimately not selected, it was an eligible technology. So there is the opportunity for hydro to participate through clean energy and zero carbon procurements, and solicitations, and mandates. Another place we see an opportunity for hydropower is that, again, as there's a larger amount of variable renewables integrated onto the grid, or for example, large penetration of offshore wind, what role does both large hydro and pumped hydro storage play in providing flexibility and stability? We also think that in future energy storage mandates or technology, that states could consider that pumped hydro needs longer lead times to develop, that they would benefit from long-term contracts, and that streamlined permitting for a designated low impact pumped hydro technology could make this technology more feasible. So that is, sorry to rush through the last bit, but I wanted to leave time for your questions. So we've got a few that have come through, and as a reminder, please go ahead and type in your questions. Jason, I'm going to go back to you for our first question, and Sam, if you could pull Jason's slides back up, and then Jason, maybe you can direct Sam to the correct slide. But we had a question on Massachusetts REC prices. In one of your slides, you showed that in Mass 1 versus Mass 2, Mass 1 is in a modest surplus, whereas Mass 2 is in a modest shortage. Why are the Mass 1 RECs more expensive?
Okay. In short, it would be because while there may be a modest surplus now, so the effect of which would be to prevent the price from going all the way to the price cap, which is called the alternative compliance payment, which is around $70. So answer one is, the modest surplus keeps it at that $40 level, but it is higher because looking out into the future, the market has an expectation, or at least it has an understanding that, as Val, I think it was described, the mass class 1 market demand is going to increase at 2% per year through 2029, and then 1% per year thereafter. So that market is considering the dynamics of, will additional facilities be permitted? Will offshore wind happen or not? On what timeline? And trying to anticipate, RECs now versus REC availability later. How much should be purchased? How much could be banked? In Massachusetts Class 2, the dynamics are different. The demand side targets are capped at 3.6%, and starting in 2022. Policymakers have actually just reached that cap. So, and it has a much lower alternative compliance payment. I'm going from memory, I think it's in the mid to upper 20s. So those things as well, constrain the price from going too much higher in Mass Class 2.
Great, thanks. So I've got a broad question on Canadian hydropower participation. I think both you and I mentioned that Canadian hydro qualifies for Vermont's Tier 1. Can you talk more about the market dynamics that this causes?
Yeah, sure. So first, just a quick reminder that Vermont went a different direction on the nomenclature. So Tier 1 in Vermont is like Class 2 or existing in other markets. So it is not like Class 1 in other markets. So just a quick point of clarification there, which hopefully will help. Yeah, what Vermont has done uniquely, and Val did a great job describing this, is it's not only allowed large hydro, but allowed the hydro portion of Canadian system imports. So again, as Val accurately described, you don't need to have a unit-specific import, so we don't know exactly which units the facilities are serving the renewable energy standard in Vermont. And either way, these facilities are not eligible for any other RPS category in New England. So I think that's the bottom line, is that there's a unique source of supply. It's eligible only in Vermont for Tier 1. And so at least in the short term, it just creates a dynamic where the utilities contracted to those resources probably have plenty of supply to meet their obligation in the early years.
Great, thank you. And this is a clarifying question, which I don't know the answer to. So Jason, let me run it by you. Does the Mass Clean Energy Standard include Eastern Canada? So would imports from Hydro-Quebec be included?
Yes, it does. The unique thing about the Mass CES is that the hydro, while the hydro facilities qualify, in order to be eligible, they need to be delivered over transmission constructed after a certain date, which really brings you specifically to the New England Clean Energy Connect line, which has been proposed and largely approved, although is still several years away from operating, or energizing, I guess would be the right word, if it ever gets there, which is still a little difficult to say. So yeah, it has uniquely created the situation where the supply for the CES will come from hydro over new transmission from Eastern Canada through Maine.
Great, thank you. So Jason, we saw on some of your slides that REC prices are quite low in certain tiers, I believe $1 per REC in some instances, yet we see hydro facilities participating. Can we infer that $1 REC is still worthwhile for hydropower facilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in case it would benefit some of our participants to see the slide again, it's the fourth slide. If this is number 1, if you go down, there you go. Just to let people run their eyes over it as we talk about these questions. Not being a hydro owner or operator myself, I can't tell you on authority, but yes, it would appear that facilities that have found it easy enough to participate year in and year out, perhaps who have a large enough volume of RECs and can maybe also sell them forward for a period of 3 to 5 or more years, would find in total that even though the price per REC is only $1 or perhaps less, it would appear that the sum total of those things do make it worth it for them.
Likely, developer would be unable to finance a new facility at that REC price. What do you think about financing efficiency improvement or a capacity addition? Any insights there?
Well, no specific insight, except I can speak pretty definitively to the policy objective. I would say for the Class 2 and existing tiers, policymakers would really not be trying to produce a REC premium that would allow you to fund a capacity expansion, but they would intend to be providing just enough revenue to maintain the facility or to maintain it in line with the eligibility criteria.
Great.
So you'd really need to look to the Class 1 or new markets as those that would be, intended to fund a capacity expansion.
Great, thank you. Well, we have reached the top of the hour. So I want to thank you, Jason, for speaking and all the great work that you and SEA have done on this report, including the invaluable data that folks can see again and read more about in section 2 of the report. You can also access a recording of this webinar. And Rebecca, definitely want to thank you for being a champion of our work and putting this project in our hands. Thank you to all our listeners. Sam, are there any upcoming webinars you'd like me to bring to everyone's attention? Okay, 3 upcoming webinars are up on your screen all this month. You can find more information about them on our website and register there as well. Thank you, everyone.